We can provide one for you if you didn't bring one. When we get to the time for opening the floor to your questions, we've placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right. Please line up at the mic so that everyone can hear your question, as we want that question to be heard in our audio recording of the event. We are live streaming today's program, and you or anyone you know can also soon find it at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this table, so if you've not already purchased the book, we have many copies behind our registers at the front of the store. We will ask you to line up starting here at the pillar. We will also come by the line to ask your name for personalizations, so please have your books ready for us. The author is going to stay as long as he needs to, but he does have an event after this, and so I would ask that you would please line up and be prepared to have the signing line move efficiently. Once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. So now, without further ado, tonight I'm very excited to welcome Cody Keenan, celebrating the release of his book, Grace, President Obama and 10 Days in the Battle for America. I am particularly excited to welcome him today. It is his birthday. Happy birthday, Cody. His book was praised in a Washington Monthly Review as written with an equal measure of wit, humility, and heart. Grace is framed around pressing and competing speechwriting deadlines facing Keenan and his team during 10 hectic days in June 2015. Keenan studied political science at Northwestern University and worked in the Senate office of Senator Ted Kennedy before studying for a master's degree at the Harvard Kennedy School. After graduation, he took a full-time position on the Obama presidential campaign and became Obama's deputy director of speechwriting in 2009, succeeding John Favreau as director of speechwriting in 2013. He is currently a partner at leading speechwriting firm Fenway Strategies and teaches a popular course on political speechwriting at his alma mater, Northwestern University. He lives in New York City with his wife, Kristen, and their daughter, Gracie. Keenan will be joined in conversation by our moderator, Jen Psaki. Psaki has been called one of the best press secretaries ever, a fitting accolade given that her tenure as the White House press secretary covered one of the most complex periods in modern presidential history. Prior to her time in the Biden White House, Psaki was a longtime advisor to President Barack Obama. She served as a traveling press secretary on his first long-shot campaign, and later served as the White House communications director for the final years of the Obama presidency. Psaki also served as the administration's public face on the global stage during her tenure as the State Department spokesperson, traveling the world with Secretary of State John Kerry. She is a former CNN political commentator and former vice president of communications and strategy at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This fall, Psaki will join MSNBC, where she will host a new streaming show that is slated to debut in early 2023. Please welcome Cody Keenan and Jen Psaki.
All right. I do feel a fitting start to this evening is for all of us to sing happy birthday to Cody.
You're cutting into question time.
I'm going to get it started. Are we ready? I'm a terrible singer, so please, people, everybody join me. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Cody. Happy birthday to you. All right.
Thank you.
How many? Like 29 plus?
Yeah, that's not polite.
What do you think? I'm kidding. A little older than that, but.
Well, it's the first birthday I've spent in 3 years without people who aren't on my taxes.
I know. There you go. Okay. So, Cody, I knew you were going to write a really eloquent book because you're a beautiful speechwriter. What I didn't expect is that it would be such an emotional book for me to read. I mean, I lived through this time, and one of my favorite days ever in the White House, which was the day that gay marriage became the law of the land, and the president then president, sang Amazing Grace, and of course we lit the White House up in rainbow colors. I mean, what's a better day? It's a pretty amazing day. But what you do in the book is you kind of take us back to the Selma speech and to the days preceding. Why? And why was that something you wanted to capture in the book?
Yeah, when I left the White House, I didn't want to write a memoir, and I didn't know what I wanted to write. And the 10 days that the book covers really became clear in all the years after. But the prologue of the book involves the writing of the Selma speech, not just to take you into kind of this incredible writing process where it snowed in Washington, and when the federal government shuts down. So it did shut down 2 days before his speech in Selma. But I went into work because I knew all of his meetings would be pulled down. And we got to work together all day and pass 5 drafts back and forth, each one getting better than the last. And that speech ended up becoming the purest distillation of his vision of patriotism and American exceptionalism. And I stole the thesis of that speech as the thesis for this book. He knows.
He's fine with it.
Yeah, and he described what happened in Selma as not a clash of armies, but a clash of wills, a contest to determine the true meaning of America. And I think that's true of politics. And so I picked these 10 days, not only because all the events in them were so extraordinary, and it's funny, when I was telling people about this idea, everybody remembers all the events in the book, but it blew their mind that it was all in the same week. And each of the events in the book, whether it was, the first day of the book is the white supremacist act of terrorism in Charleston, where a self-radicalized guy went in, he was obsessed with Confederate iconography and murdered 8 black parishioners and their pastor in the middle of Bible study. And that threatened to open up, we always kind of went into high alert after a mass shooting, but this one threatened to open up some really ugly stuff in the country. And then the families of the victims surprised everybody who's not steeped in the AME church by going to the killer's arraignment and one by one on live television forgiving him, even though they were crying, even though he'd taken their parents and their children away, they forgave him one by one. And I'd never seen anything like it. And I'm convinced it kind of changed the way the country was walking over the next few days. You saw the Republican governor of Alabama kind of quietly order the Confederate flag to be brought down over the State House. You saw Strom Thurmond's kid, who, I mean, not a kid, he's in the 60s now, but a state rep in South Carolina say, you know what, it was wrong and my dad was wrong, and it's time to bring down that flag. You saw Amazon and Walmart and Sears stop selling Confederate flag merchandise. And then we get to the Supreme Court cases. We'd been working on these since even before the shooting happened, where my entire team, which a whole bunch of them are here, we had to work on a bunch of different speeches because we didn't know which way the Supreme Court would rule.
Well, you talk about this as SCOTUS week. First of all, did you know what that was before you worked in the White House? I did not. No. Can you explain to people here who have no idea what that is, and kind of what it, as a speechwriter, what does that mean when you're preparing for SCOTUS week?
SCOTUS week
Supreme Court of the United States.
Yeah, SCOTUS week is like the NCAA tournament for legal nerds. It's when the Supreme Court rules on a whole slew of cases, but it directly impacts the lives of tens of millions of Americans. And we were watching 2 in particular in 2015. We were watching Obamacare and marriage equality. And this is where the whole book kind of comes together. If Charleston was about whether or not we're going to stand up against white supremacy and for the fact that all of us are created equal and deserve to be safe and deserve to live full and happy lives, these cases were about whether or not America guarantees poor people and people working 2 jobs and middle-class people health insurance, whether or not gay Americans are allowed to get married like everybody else, or whether we're going to deem them second-class citizens. So all of these big questions about America kind of came to the fore at the same time. So for the Supreme Court, for SCOTUS week, the speechwriters had to prepare speeches for every eventuality, because we find out at the same time as everybody else. There's no early heads up for the White House. I mean, this year there was that leak before Dobbs, but that didn't happen with us.
Unprecedented. Never happened before.
So we had to prepare speeches for win or lose, and drafting the speeches for what does the president say to the country if the Supreme Court says no, you can't get married, or the Supreme Court says no, you can't have health insurance. That's pretty dark. And so we were working on all those when this shooting happens, and then a whole debate unfolds about whether or not Obama's going to give a eulogy.
So you also cover in the speech. Sorry, I'm like old practice here. In the book, the fact that President Obama didn't really want to give this speech. I mean, you prepared for a lot with SCOTUS week, for nerds, but you don't predict shootings, obviously, and you don't know what is going to throw into disarray your life in the White House. So, and I was in these meetings too. So tell us a little bit about what a lot of people who've never worked in the White House don't see, which is when a president doesn't want to do something and they need to do the thing. So how do you get them to do the thing? So tell us a little bit about that and that journey with former President Obama.
Yeah, I mean, there's a pretty dramatic scene in this book, and it was day 6 of the 10 days. So the shooting had happened 5 days prior, and Jen was there, and we were in the Oval Office with the president and Josh Earnest and Valerie Jarrett. And the president did not want to go give a eulogy. And I didn't want to write a eulogy. They were hard enough as it was, and having to write one after this was even harder. And it was pretty selfish on my part, but I was like, I don't want to do this.
And why didn't he want to do it?
He didn't want to do it because, and this goes back a few years before the book, everybody remembers the mass shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, when 20 little kids were murdered in their classrooms. I mean, we're educators who were trying to protect them. And that was just about a month after the president was reelected. And he decided to set aside his second-term agenda right out of the gate and instead try to do something about guns. Knowing the odds were long, knowing the makeup of the Senate made it almost impossible. But there was a little glimmer of hope. We had, Joe Manchin, who Democrats usually love to hate, and Pat Toomey, who was a very conservative Republican from Pennsylvania, and both of them had A ratings from the NRA. They got together and wrote a background checks bill. And that alone gave us hope that maybe there's a chance here. And, Toomey said we can bring a couple Republicans along. And so the president kind of barnstormed the country for the first 3 months after his inauguration. He made it a centerpiece of his State of the Union address. And in April, with the parents looking on from the Senate gallery, Republicans blocked a vote on background checks entirely. And that was the most cynical I've ever seen him. And one of the 3 times I've ever seen him angry. And after he spoke in the Rose Garden with those parents, he came back inside and said, look, the next time this happens, I don't want to speak. I don't want to, what am I going to say? We tried, and the country has decided we're just not going to do anything about this anymore. So I don't want to go out after each mass shooting and give a eulogy and have that be the end of the grief cycle and the signal that we can move on, because I don't want to move on from this. And he held firm to that a couple times. There were 2 more mass shootings after that at military bases, and as commander-in-chief, you got to go. But Charleston was kind of the first true test. And at first, he stuck to his guns. He said, no, I'm not doing this. But then Monday in that kind of heated Oval meeting, Valerie said, you got to do this. And, Obama said, he said, I have run out of words. I have nothing left to say. And he pointed at me and said, do you? And I said, no. And it was, as I write in the book, it was one of the first times he used me as a human shield rather than a punching bag, which was nice.
A better place.
Yeah, a better place. And that's when Josh Earnest stepped in. And Josh is a man of deep faith. Some of the best edits to speeches that my team and I wrote were, if we weren't naturally predisposed to put faith into speeches, Dennis McDonough and Josh would suggest it. Because, a huge swath of the country is religious and faithful, and we wouldn't always think of it. And so Josh spoke up and said, look, I'm not advocating for you to do this, but if you do, what those families did on Friday was pretty powerful. And that kind of flipped a switch in the president. And he said, look, he came around the desk, and he did a rant on the Confederate flag. It's in the book. And came around the desk and kind of softened a little bit and said, look, if grace is a powerful thing. If I am to speak, that's what I want to talk about, And right then I knew he'd made up his mind, and I was just like, damn it. Because then it falls to us, the speechwriters. And he said, he said he didn't give us much to go on, and he's admitted this. He talks about it in his podcast with Bruce Springsteen. He said, talk about guns, talk about race, talk about the Confederate flag, but wrap it all up in grace. And I'm just like, okay.
No problem.
Yeah.
Well, the other piece you talk about in the book is kind of the pressure that President Obama had on him to kind of solve race in the country or racial divisions in the country. And you talk about an email that our former colleague and friend John Favreau got from a CNN producer asking if President Obama would solve race in the country with this Charleston speech. Literally, this was the phrasing in the email. Tell us a little bit about that, because I remember that being a pressure on him, in addition to not being able to do a lot on mass shootings and the limitations of that, but also this pressure that if he were to utter words, it would solve the divisions along racial lines in the country.
Yeah, you are not all powerful as president. You need 60 votes in the Senate until we get 2 more votes to get rid of the filibuster, and then you can just do it with 50 as it's supposed to be. But also, he had this burden on him from the start, and everybody placed these high expectations into him. And part of the first campaign was, and I don't think we did this, you and I were both there, this wasn't a conscious decision, but people placed, he became a vessel for everybody's hopes and aspirations. And those of us on the inside, we never once thought that somehow an Obama presidency is going to usher in a post-racial society. That's just not going to happen. And as president, I write about this a lot in the book, and I've never had a pithy, easy answer for it, but he couldn't just be the black president, and because I had a black moderator the other night in Seattle who asked some pretty tough questions about it, and he couldn't just be the black president. He had to speak to everybody, and that was both because of the nature of the job, but you also have to win. You have to win re-election to do what you want. You have to win your first election to do what you promise. And the reason he won in the first place was because he practiced a politics of redemption and not recrimination. He didn't scold people. He didn't blame people for the sins of the past. He gave people the chance to change and become better, because that's how he viewed America. Like, what makes America exceptional in his book is the fact that we can change. And that's why he talked that way, not just in the race speech in 2008, but in all of his speeches. And that's how he ended up winning not just the white vote in Wisconsin, the white working class vote in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan, but Indiana for the first time in 48 years, and North Carolina for the first time in 44 years. And that held true through all of his biggest speeches. One of the most brilliant lines he inserted into the Selma speech was, "What a remarkable thing it would be for the South to rise again, not by reasserting the past, but by transcending the past." He just gives people the chance to be better. And in the Charleston speech, which we'll talk about, he did the same thing. He used the lyrics of Amazing Grace to basically give us all permission to start over and say, maybe we've been blind to each of these challenges. Something like this helps us see that now. And it's not quite as satisfying as screaming, this is right and that is wrong, but it's a more sustainable path.
I was going to kind of end with this, but I'm going to jump to it now, and then we'll come back to more specifics, just so everybody knows the program here. But in your book, you do, as you just quoted, you talk about how, President Obama believed that racism was structural and pervasive. He, quote, didn't lecture audiences about what they were doing wrong or what they were saying wrong or that their whole life was built on historical sin. He didn't shame people for not holding the most politically correct viewpoint on any given issue. That's in the book, so buy it. You can read more. But I also think if people are here, you've probably been grappling with levels of anger about what we've seen during the Trump years and what we've seen happen in our country and misogyny and racism and what we've seen pervade society, unless you're like hate buying the book and then buy it so we can continue to be a bestseller. That's fine. But, I wanted to ask you just about whether you think his approach would still work today. I mean, is it outdated, or would his approach, if he were president today, or if he were the leader of the Democratic Party today, still be effective in the face of Trump? I
think it would. And the only evidence I have for that, it's hard to prove it, but he's the only president since Eisenhower who won 51% of the vote twice. And Donald Trump lost. That's why I think it still works. You can be noisy. All Trump was really good at was calling attention to himself. He's not a good communicator. He's a good communicator if your goal is just headlines. But the only policy they ever passed...
Good tweeter, some might say.
You know what I say? You know what I tell my students is speechwriting is thinking before you speak, and tweeting is speaking before you think. And the evidence is that he only passed one major piece of legislation, a tax cut for billionaires. He lost re-election. Where presidents' words do matter, people will also ask me all the time, do speeches still matter? A speech doesn't solve everything. Sometimes it doesn't solve anything. But the way Trump used language to crack open fissures and divides, to air petty grievances, opened up all sorts of nasty stuff that was always there, but hidden and kind of kept under wraps by other presidents' rhetoric and by the rest of us. And he gave them a permission structure to march without hoods in Charlottesville and to engage in political violence, to the point where we have sitting senators saying, if we don't get our way, there are going to be riots in the streets. And that's how you know a president's words matter.
So one of the things I love about this book is that it's written through your eyes, right? Which is not just about the history of the moment, but the history of somebody who was playing a really important role living it. And what was so amazing to me is I lived like not a different opposing side, but you're all operating in the White House, kind of doing your role and doing your job. So I learned a lot from reading the book, which was kind of cool. I wanted to ask you just about White House speechwriters. Maybe there's some aspiring here, some former, I don't know.
Lots of former.
Lots of former, maybe again future, who knows. How do you navigate the role of being a speechwriter in the White House where you're capturing the president's words, but you have to get feedback from everybody. Sometimes it's really annoying, which you certainly say in the book. And sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's pablum. What do you do with that? And how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of grievances, I do air a few in the book about people trying to get things into speeches mostly. It's a real challenge. I mean, I'll get to writing for him in a second, but you're also negotiating with cabinet agencies and everybody who has an idea, and people would just barge into your office at the State. People would stake out the West Wing bathroom during State of the Union address time.
Oh my God!
Because I would always keep the door closed.
People lose their mind around the State of the Union.
Lose their mind. The only people who were really great at State of the Union time, and I don't really know everyone who's here, so I'm going to be a little careful. But hey, boss, our old chief of staff's over there. The Department of Education. I came in one morning and there was a bottle of bourbon on my desk with a note card that just said, "Don't forget the Department of Education." So they did great. But that wasn't the challenge. Those were always little annoyances, but still, everybody is doing it for a reason and with their heart in the right place because they just want their issue into speeches. And we had all sorts of battles with policy people, all sorts of battles with fact checkers.
Members of Congress.
The hardest part of it was writing for him because he was such a good writer. He did Dreams for My Father when he was in his 30s. And he's on record going back to the first campaign in New York Magazine, or New Yorker, saying, "I'm a better speechwriter than my speechwriters." I can't tell you the number of times he has reminded me that he wrote the 2004 convention speech himself. So he always viewed speechwriting as a collaborative exercise. He viewed us as real collaborators. He wanted us to give him something he could work with. We knew that, but that wasn't enough. We wanted to give him something that would impress him. And sometimes that would drive us to, we'd pull all-nighters. We'd sleep in the office. We would drive ourselves just to tears trying to draft something good. And when it came to something like the Charleston eulogy that touches on 3/3 rails of America, it was a lot.
So tell us, because most people haven't seen this, including people who have worked in White Houses. How does the process work? How did it work with former President Obama? Did you write a draft first, or you brainstormed first? And you capture a little bit of this in the book, but
for a message event, if we were going to go talk about clean energy or healthcare or student loans, he trusted us to write a draft and then give it to him the night before. And he'd always dive. I think everybody's probably seen. If you're here, you've probably seen Pete Souza's photos of his edits, and so. But eventually, when they all come out in the library, people will get to see everything Barack Obama did to speeches, which is going to be great. When it came to these big speeches, we would be desperate to get time with him on the front end, desperate to get his ideas first. That's why I went to work on a snow day to just grab him before Selma. And with Charleston, when he finally decided he was going to do this, I grabbed Chase, our scheduler, and was like, I need 30 minutes. I just need it, or I can't do this. Because he was that good, but getting that prompt from him in the first part was really helpful. I didn't get that with Charleston. I did get it with Selma in a pretty great way. People will ask, where do you find inspiration? I find inspiration from Rudy Giuliani. Only once. It was only once, and this was the Selma speech. This is a speech I write about this in the prologue, where Barack Obama was going down to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Selma marches. And, on his own, just a black president showing up there is a pretty powerful symbolic thing. You can just kind of leave it at that. But that was never enough for him. And we were trying to figure out where to take the speech. And the week before, Giuliani gave this kind of bumbling monologue where he was just desperately trying to impress the base. And it was about how Barack Obama he's not one of us. He wasn't raised like one of us. He doesn't love America like we do. And, it made me mad. So I decided to bring it up during that snow day. I was like, hey, did you hear what Rudy Giuliani said? And I told him, and he goes, well, first of all, who the F cares what Rudy Giuliani has to say? But then he took the bait and he said that, it does bring up an idea worth taking on, which is how do we decide who gets to be an American? Who's more American than somebody else? What enough with Sarah Palin and flag pins and bald eagles and real America. There are lots of real Americas out there. So let's make the speech about that. Let's recast the story of America in a bigger, truer way with the bigger cast of characters that made us who we are. And it turned into this big, joyous speech, all thanks to Rudy Giuliani.
Thanks, Rudy. So you write the speech, you go back and forth, and you capture this so well moment by moment in the book. What happens when you go in and you have a draft and he doesn't like it? What was the sign?
Oh, well, glad you asked. He would usually begin by saying, this is well written. But, what was great is as a junior speechwriter, I would always view his edits as painful, like I'd done something wrong. You eventually come to realize that that's a good thing. It means you gave him something he could work with, and it would get to the point where we would be excited to get to work in the morning and see what he'd done to the speech to make it better. But back to the whole collaborative thing. With Charleston, I've hinted at this, but I just could not get it there. I could not get the draft where it needed to be, and the rest of my team was busy working on the healthcare speeches and the marriage equality speeches, and I knew it, and I gave it to him and told him as much, and he called me back to the White House that night around 10 o'clock to the residence. So I had been working on this speech for 3 days, and in 3 hours, he tore up the back 2 pages. He just drew one line through the entire page, which he had never done to me before. And he'd rewritten the entire thing longhand.
At this point, you've been working for him for 6.5 years? 7?
Including the
7
campaign?
years?
Yeah, 8 years.
Yeah.
He'd never done that. And he'd just done this. He literally cut the speech out where I just wrote the phrase Amazing Grace, and then he added the lyrics, and he built the back half. He built this beautiful, simple structure out of the lyrics, which it's one of those things where you kind of kick yourself for not thinking of it. And so he basically tore up speech for the first time, and for the first time, I apologized to him and told him, sorry, I just couldn't get it there. And he did something pretty cool. It shows the kind of boss he is. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, look, brother, we're collaborators. You gave me what I needed to work with here. You'll recognize some of your work in there. And when you've been thinking about these issues for 40 years, you'll know what you want to say too. And that shows you what kind of boss he is, because he could have just, said, here are my edits, get out of here, do better. Even worse, he could have just excised me from the equation and given the edits to you or Josh or Dennis and said, just get these back to Cody, which would make me feel even worse. But the fact that we spent a half hour going through those edits, and then I had to go spend 3 hours working everything in, and it makes you feel good about yourself rather than bad about yourself.
I used to know he had enough when he would go, and you were like, oh God, I don't know if everybody else in the meeting knows what's about to happen. Nothing bad. It was just that was his point of frustration. So also in the process is the fact-checking process. And I'm just going to bring it into the personal side here because your lovely wife is sitting here. Hello, Kristen, the mother of Grace. Yeah, clap for Kristen. But what is so cool about their relationship is that they've survived it and thrived and had a child after Kristen meticulously fact-checked Cody's speeches for many years. And they're still married, happy, have a child. So that's wonderful. So that is part of the process too. So tell us a little bit about that. An essential part of the process, I should say, when you're writing for the President of the United States. But how did that work?
Yeah, Kristen and her team were, he called them research, but it's not a great name for it. They were really fireproofers. They were pre-crisis consultants. They prevented your problems.
If Kristen tells me something isn't true, it's not true. That's what I know.
They made sure for 8 years that the president didn't say something that was wrong with somebody he shouldn't be with at a place he shouldn't be. They prevented countless alternate timelines where we were fighting optics battles and you know.
An optics battle is when you're worried about how people will see things, read them in the press, or how the press will write about things, right? Yeah.
And so it's not just that it was my future wife's job to tell me I was wrong. It was her job to tell me I was wrong every day in a meticulously documented. It's like, here are the 20 ways you were wrong today with citations. But it made the speeches better, you know? And the fact that we did that for 5 years together in the White House and still got married, I think, is a testament to our love. She did not fact check this book. She refused. Yeah. So.
Yay, Kristen. Okay, I think Kristen getting a round of applause is fully well-deserved. So I remember the moment where President Obama sang Amazing Grace. I was 8.5 months pregnant, which, by the way, Cody captures multiple times in the book, where I'm eating every time. I'm always eating. I'm always wobbling around. So there's that. But it did remind me, reading the book, of how uncomfortable it is to be 9 months pregnant. So thank you for that. But I remember walking by the small television in the upper press area, which is, you know, it's there's like a 19, I don't know, maybe it's bigger now, 19-inch television set, which I walk by and I caught out of the corner. And now remember the morning, the president had just done a speech in the Rose Garden. It was a beautiful day when gay marriage became the law of the land. It was already an emotional day in a good way. And I remember walking by and he heard him start singing Amazing Grace. I mean, I only recently don't cry when I talk about this story because it was such an amazing moment. But you kind of knew it might happen. Tell us about that. And then what was it like in the room when he just started singing? I mean, he doesn't have a beautiful singing voice. He was a great president, but that's not his strength. But like, tell us about this moment.
He would disagree with you.
He might. Better singer than everyone. So tell us about that moment. What did it feel like in the room? And you knew, and you read about this in the book, it might happen.
Yeah, well, first of all, I feel bad that we never gave you a heads up. I forgot to email you and say he might sing.
Was it because I was pregnant and you were discriminating against me?
because I hadn't slept in 3 days.
Oh, no, I'm kidding.
Yeah, I mean, that morning was extraordinary. He had written the lyrics in overnight, and it's still another thing that it just hadn't occurred to me that he might sing it. And this comes from not being steeped in the AME church, like he had come to be, knowing that those people would be there to sing with him, so that he wouldn't be alone. But he, you know, we went out and he spoke in the Rose Garden after marriage equality. It was already a joyous morning in the White House. It's just, I was really anxious about this ruling because we had so many friends and colleagues who their futures depended on this. And I didn't know how I would look one of my colleagues in the eye if the Supreme Court had ruled the other way. Fortunately, they didn't. And a young woman on my team, Sarah Perry, who I don't see but her husband's here, drafted the president's remarks for marriage equality, and they were beautiful. And he did something really rare. He ad-libbed a lot in remarks all the time, but he rarely ad-libbed at the end of a speech. Because when you ad-lib in the middle of a speech, you know where to come back to. You've got a runway. He just kept going after the marriage equality remarks were over on the page. And so I'm standing there in the Rose Garden being like, oh God, where's he going to go? How's he going to land this plane? And he did this kind of beautiful thing about how, and it's a big theme of this book, about how none of these victories were actually ours. They were the result of decades of marching and organizing and bleeding. And he added this great bit about how it was actually just thousands upon thousands of small acts of courage of people coming out and their families accepting them that made this possible, that made it possible for the country to come so far so fast, relatively speaking, on a civil rights and equal rights issue. So his heart was full. He also talked really, really slowly. He was just kind of thinking, even slower than usual, thinking on the fly. And I asked him afterwards, I was like, yo, man, why? That was like 2 paragraphs and it took like 7 minutes. Why? And he said, well, I was just tired from rewriting your remarks all night. But I know that's not true because he gave them back to me at 11 o'clock. I think he was genuinely moved by the fact that the country had come so far so fast on something like this. And the military is precise. 5 minutes after he finishes speaking, Marine One is on the South Lawn, and we board Marine One. And it's the president, the first lady, Secretary McDonough, Valerie Jarrett, and me sitting in the front cabin. And the president's still working on the speech as he does. You know, it's funny. A reporter emailed me after reading the book being like, you know, We used to harass you guys forever saying, where's the text, where's the text? Now I know he was just still working on it. He would work all the way up till the last minute. And so he's still working on the helicopter, and I had just asked Kristen to marry me, so the First Lady is just peppering me with questions like, did you ask her dad? What's she wearing? Where is it? Can we come? And so we land, and the president hands me the draft back with his edits and stands up and says, if it feels right, I might sing it. And it just hadn't occurred to me. And generally my first reaction is to be a little risk averse, to find reasons to protect him from himself, find reasons why he shouldn't do something. But our hearts were full that morning, and I was exhausted, so I just said, you do you, man. And I didn't actually go to the arena. I stayed on Air Force One because he decided to edit it again on the plane, and he took 2 pages with him, and I just decided, as much as I wanted to be there, the risk that our wireless cards wouldn't work or I wouldn't be able to get the speech to the teleprompter or whatever was too great, so I stayed on the plane. And I watched it from the plane, in Charleston, but I watched it from the plane. And I knew he was going to sing. There were 5 of us on the planet that knew. Well, I'd emailed Kristen to tell her, but he paused for 11 seconds. And my first thought was, oh, God, everyone watching is going to think he lost a page, and it's my fault. And then he sang, and just stunned people. I remember because I was on the plane, I was checking Twitter, and it was just like nonstop, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. People just losing their minds. The White House staff that was at the arena came racing out from underneath being like, is he singing? And I asked him again afterwards, I said, what's with the pause? Were you trying to be dramatic? And he goes, no, man. He said, the thing about Amazing Grace is you got to start low. Otherwise, when you get to a wretch like me, your voice cracks. So I was just preparing myself.
Resetting. Well, I know we're going to get to audience questions in a moment, but a couple of quick ones. You promised to stay 8 years. Was there ever a moment that you thought, I can't stay 8 years? I'm having a terrible day, a terrible week.
There were. I really did want to stay 8 years, mostly because I just couldn't imagine leaving. I couldn't imagine leaving and regretting every single day I wasn't there. There were the days I thought about leaving were days where I felt like I didn't have anything else to give and that somebody could have done better. And then it was usually someone on our staff, usually Dennis, who would buck us up and eliminate that notion. Secondarily, I always joked when people would ask, I'd say, I'm not leaving until the Cubs win the World Series. And then they did. And they finally came to the White House 4 days before we left office.
Oh, there you go. So you only had 4 days left at that point.
Yeah, then I quit.
Okay, before we get to audience questions, I think they gave instructions, which was to line up in the microphone. Was that the basics of it? Okay. If your question is too long or rude, I may jump in. So just letting you know that. Okay, 2 questions because everybody couldn't be here. So I took questions from Twitter too. I know Twitter's evil sometimes, but sometimes it's good. Okay, so David Darmofel, I don't know if I pronounced his name the right way, asked you what the most surprising aspect of being a speechwriter is.
That's a really good question. I didn't have an image of what the White House would be like. So either everything was a surprise or nothing was a surprise. But it was, I'm filibustering because I don't have a great answer that was surprising. What I will say is that what got us through was my team, my extraordinary team of speechwriters, and that extended to everybody else in the White House too. And this was forged on the campaign. We loved each other. Mm-hmm. We worked together and everybody thinks this sounds so weird because we just came through a White House that was the opposite. And White Houses before were different too, but we worked on the longest primary campaign of all time. And we literally, and we turned into a family because of that, literally. And a bunch of us moved in together and lived together. And we went to people's parents' funerals, and we went to weddings, and a whole bunch of us married each other. And
that makes it sound a little sketchy, but not meant to be.
There are dozens and dozens of couples who met working for Barack Obama, whether in Iowa or in the White House. Yeah. And I saw him a few weeks ago and joked to them that you've got dozens of grandbabies running around this country. That's not surprising, but I think it might surprise a lot of people to know that it was like that it was collegial, that it was loving, that it was a great place to work with great people to work. And that doesn't mean we weren't stressed out all the time. That doesn't mean we didn't argue. That doesn't mean when I was particularly down about a speech, I would snap at someone to get out of my office. But it was just, what a wonderful gift to be able to do that for 8 years with people that you come to love.
It's about the people. There is one Twitter question, which is sort of fun, which is, are you a Swiftie? Which I'm really asking for my 7-year-old daughter, a Taylor Swift fan. You know, are you? No?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I'm
Good.
a Swiftie.
I'm glad we resolved that. Now we can go on to some serious questions, or not, or any questions. Go ahead. Do you want to know, like, name,
Yeah, quick name.
where you're from, anything else? Yeah.
Yes. Hello. Thank you for being. I'm not sure. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for being here today, both of you. My name is Vasilis. I'm from Greece. Actually, I just moved to Washington 2 months ago, studying in Georgetown. You talked about, and you talk about in your book as well, that he was trying to be a president for everyone, not just the people who voted for him, the people who didn't vote for him, or the people who didn't vote at all. And I think that one of the most cumulative moments for this is the State of the Union, right? Yeah. And one could speak about this like the whole day long, but how do you approach a State of the Union speech? You have to speak to many audiences, you have to speak about many topics, and the language has to, touch everyone's hearts and souls. So how does mind meet words in such an occasion?
Yeah, good question. First of all, welcome to Washington.
Thank you.
I lived here for 17 years, and I miss it here. This is a great city to live in.
It is.
And the rest of the country always shorthands it as like Washington this way. This is a cool town. The State of the Union address is the worst speech. I think it's the one that I think most young speechwriters aspire to. Like, I'd love to write a State of the Union address because movies make it look so cool. It's just awful because have you ever watched one that is memorable, that you enjoy, and that was a great speech? It becomes this beast where you have to work everything into it. And we'd always sit down before each process and say, this is the year we're going to do something different. We're going to do it somewhere on the road. We actually tried that one year, and the network said, well, we're not going to carry it because then it's just a campaign speech. They want the pomp and circumstance of the chamber. Okay, well then we're just going to do it about one topic. And everyone else who wasn't in on that topic just lost their minds. So inertia makes it what it is. And it's always helpful when the Department of Education bribes you with liquor to make sure they're in there.
Sure,
but
it is.
I have a story about this. I was lucky enough to be on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert last week, so you might have heard this story already if you saw it. But in 2015, I was determined to write a speech that was actually a little bit lyrical, almost beautiful for State of the Union address, and we built it around. There's the gallery, the First Lady's box, and you have all these real people up there. And we always use real people as a term of endearment. It means people who didn't work in the White House. Instead, I just made it around two. We talked about this woman, Rebecca Earler, who had written a beautiful letter to the president, and we told her story for about 15 minutes of the speech, but woven in with policy proposals that would actually make her life better. And I was just about to propose to my wife at the time, so I added in a line about her and her husband and telling their story, saying they were young and in love in America, and it doesn't get any better than that. And that's not the type of line you usually see in the State of the Union address. So I'm proud of this, and this is one with Corey Remsburg at the end, the disabled soldier. So the president calls me up to talk about it. I gave him a draft about 8 days out, and I was pretty confident that it was the best one yet. And he goes, sit down. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, no. Just thinking, I have to go rewrite an 8,000-word speech. And he says, I think it's well written. They actually said, I think we're in the best shape we've been in 8 days out. And I'm like, well, great. And he goes, but we still have 8 days. And he said, here's the thing. The entire speech is at a 10. Every sentence says something. Every word means something. I need some of the speech down at like 8, 6, 4, 2. I need quiet moments and emotional moments. And then he shifted course and said, you ever listen to Miles Davis? And I said, no. He said, we know what they say about Miles Davis. I said, obviously not. And he said, it's the notes you don't play. It's the silences. It's the space between that made him so good. So I want you to go home tonight, pour yourself a drink, listen to some Miles Davis. Don't do any work. But when you come back tomorrow, find me some silences. And it made sense. That's where I came up with that line about they were young and loving America and a bunch of other flourishes in it. And a State of the Union address isn't going to be carved into any buildings.
Yeah.
But I think that might have been our best one.
Okay, thank you. I should, yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for writing the book as well. In the intro, we learned that you worked for Senator Kennedy as well. My hero growing up was President Kennedy. And this speech reminds me of President Kennedy's moon speech at Rice University, which is my favorite speech. And I seemingly either watch or listen to the speech at least once every 2 months or so just to get inspiration and just hear President Kennedy speak. Now, during that speech, Kennedy had a few extemporaneous lines, which people have a tendency to recall and remember, sort of self-effacing lines. And so my question to you is, even though you knew somehow that he was going to sing Amazing Grace, it's always challenging, difficult to practice extemporaneous lines. Although Churchill, I guess, once said, "I always practice my extemporaneous lines." How did you prepare, and how did he prepare for extemporaneous lines, not only in this speech, but in other speeches as well?
It's a great question. I don't know if he practiced singing or not. I choose to believe not. And I think he let the moment just take him there. I personally practice extemporaneous lines all the time. I write about this in the book. As a speechwriter, you are constantly thinking about arguments and lines and points of attack and points of rebuttal. And it made me a terrible dinner companion because I would just space out during entire conversations because I'm thinking about a speech I've got to write. So I'm kind of working on them all the time. We didn't, you practice in debate prep, you practice things called zingers, it's stupid comebacks or whatnot, but he didn't really like doing that. He didn't like those. He didn't like sound bites. Whenever we tried to just, sometimes Ben Rhodes and I would try to come up with like the line that's going to go on the library, and he would find that in the speech and just take it out. Because every speech should tell a story from beginning to end and not be built around a line or a sound bite. So we didn't really practice those. But I'm glad that you brought up the Rice speech, because I'm not just saying this because you said it, that's my favorite speech too. The fact that JFK went up there and said something as preposterous as we're going to land a man on the moon and bring him home safely in less than 10 years. Oh, and we don't have a space agency, but we'll make one. And then it happened. It's amazing. But he also told that speech with humor and joy, and these are things that belong in our politics.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for being here. My name is Ingela. I was really excited for this book because I was actually an intern that summer in OPC, the Office of Presidential Correspondence, and the responses we got both to, his Charleston speech and the gay marriage decision were really tremendous. But I checked the index and you didn't mention OPC.
No, I did. Yes, I did.
Did you?
Fiona Reeves is all over this book.
Okay, great.
There are letters in this book from after.
Yeah, because I was just going to ask about that. President Obama made it a really big deal that he wanted to read 10 letters, from the public every day. And the way you talked about stories, how often did you guys, try to incorporate, stories into speeches?
All the time. And by the way, all of that is in the book. For real. Fiona's in the book.
Great.
There are actual printed letters in the book, some from after the Charleston speech and the marriage equality decision. And, OPE was central to everything we did. That State of the Union address I was just talking about, that was about Rebecca. That was a letter that came in that Fiona flagged and that got to the president. And it's an amazing tool to use in a speech, other people's stories, because just, I often describe Barack Obama as the most normal president we've ever had. And I'm serious. What I mean by that is, even though he was the only black president, he's still the most normal president. When he was elected president, he was 4 years removed from paying off his student loans. He was 2 years removed from pumping his own gas. He didn't have decades of yes men and yes women around him. He didn't come up through prep schools and Harvard and Yale. Like, he went to Harvard Law eventually, but that was after he was born in Hawaii to a white mother and white grandparents who took care of him, moved to Indonesia and went to Occidental, and then he was us. He lived a life that was closer to everybody else than the lily white composite of the 43 former presidents who all went to Harvard and Yale. But even so, when you go into the White House, you live in a castle with a moat around it and armed guards and a flying fortress and a bulletproof tank. So it was his idea before taking office. He said, I want 10 letters a day from ordinary Americans, and I want them to be representative. It doesn't help me if all 10 are like, you're just the best. And I want my speechwriters to see him too. And we read them every night, and they were so helpful. Polling data and focus groups have their purpose, but to read the way that real people describe issues infused our speeches. I would change the way I looked at certain things. And sometimes we'd find somebody like Rebecca that introduced the president in Minnesota after that letter, who was the centerpiece of a State of the Union address. And Kristen and I are still really good friends with her and her husband, and we text all the time. I was going to see her on Sunday at an event I'm doing with Pete Souza. OPC was critical. So don't be you just came up here to complain.
No, I forgot to. I mean, I looked for like a lot of different things, but I forgot to look for Fiona's name in the index.
See,
so.
this is why I fought not to have an index, because it's a Washington thing. You're going to be super happy with the way correspondence is in this book.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm from Minnesota, and I just moved here. I'm getting my master's in political communication. So I had a question of any tips you would have for an aspiring speechwriter.
Sure. Welcome to town. We do this every Friday.
Thank you.
Write your brains out. It's breaking into speechwriting is really difficult. There's like a built-in catch-22, and you go to get a speechwriting job. They say, "Great, show me speeches you've written." You say, "Well, I don't have any because nobody's hired me yet." So you have to start writing. You know, this is what I do for my students. When they graduate, they're going to have a portfolio of 10 speeches they can show somebody. You have to find a way to do that. Professors give speeches. Deans give speeches. There are 535 members of Congress and some of them don't have speechwriters. Find ways to write. Place an op-ed in your hometown paper. That's basically just a 750-word speech. But just try to build a little portfolio. And in addition to that, read as widely as you can, because you can't be a good speechwriter if you don't read widely, if you don't see other people's points of view, if you don't see other arguments, like I was just saying about the letters, if you don't see other ways of looking at things. I would pull inspiration from everywhere, and I would read constantly and just keep like a really intense notes and files, and I had like this crazy filing system in my email for all sorts of ideas. So I don't know that I recommend becoming a speechwriter, because you end up developing this like intense relationship with self-loathing and self-doubt, and then you write a book about it. But it is pretty wonderful.
Thank you.
With all these former speechwriters and aspirings, I feel like we need to be a linguist in here or something. But I had a burning curiosity that I thought might be appropriate for you. In the black community, probably beyond that, Obama's couched in cool and hip and sophistication. And until he got in office, you never seen a president give a black power handshake, okay, non-threatening. And I just wondered, did that make you and the staff or the culture of the White House feel a little off balance because it's such a formal setting? And whenever I see him on television and he let his hair down, symbolically or whatever, and he gives a black handshake, and sitting among the brothers, okay, we would just giggle nonstop because we know this has never happened. So I just wanted to know if it provided an aura of conformity or discomfort.
No, it made it infinitely better. It did. It made it an easier place to work. Like, he was informal with us.
Okay.
He's what you see on television. He's just a little bit more profane. But he made it so. I mean, he was a hugger. He'd give us fist pounds. There is a hilarious video. I can't remember which NBA Finals team he's meeting with. It's just from a couple years ago. He's out of the White House, and he's giving dap to every single player, like really aggressive.
Right.
And then there's a white dude, and he just like shakes his hand and moves on to the next one. So
Exactly.
he could code switch like that. But with those of us who'd been around him, he was comfortable.
Okay.
And it made us feel comfortable in return.
Okay.
Why did you want to be a speechwriter?
That's a great question, man. I didn't think about why did I want to be a speechwriter. I'd never thought about it at first. I just knew I wanted to get into politics and try to make a difference in some way. And I was lucky enough. My first boss was Ted Kennedy, the youngest Kennedy brother. And I worked for him in 2004 for 4 years, but it was during the Democratic National Convention in Boston. And we all got to go up there and volunteer that week. And our reward for volunteering was a floor pass, which means you get to go down and watch all the speakers. And my night just happened to be the night that Barack Obama gave a speech that changed his life. And, it shows you the power of a good speech. He walked into that arena in Boston, an anonymous state legislator, and walked out a global megastar after just 16 minutes. And it was somebody who was not only from my hometown, which was cool, but somebody who talked about politics the way I wanted it to be. And I went back to the Senate where I worked, and just riveted and desperate to start writing. speeches. And then I was lucky enough that a couple years later, the Obama campaign called, and John Favreau hired me as his intern, and I got to start writing speeches for the man who electrified me on the floor that day. And then I was just stubborn enough to hang on for 14 years.
Wow.
This is the last question.
Hi, Cody.
We went to high school
Cody
together.
and I went to high school together. You know, Cody
Tell
claims.
us all the things.
Oh, yes. So in addition, well, first of all, Cody claims Chicago big time, but our high school was in Connecticut. Yes, but I get it. I lived in Chicago for 7 years, just moved to Virginia. I love Chicago. I get you claiming it. All the things, let's see, main thing is he was our high school football captain. So in addition to being right? Am I right about that? He's also, yes, an athlete and a scholar. Anyway, question for you. When did you know you were good at writing? Did you study writing undergrad? Did you write in high school? Were you the editor-in-chief of the newspaper, or was that just me?
I promise. God, it was just you. It was just you. I'm thrilled by this question. I promise it wasn't a plan. First of all, I love
It was not a
Ridgefield.
plan. He did not know it was coming.
That's where we went to high school, Ridgefield High
Ridgefield
School.
is very representative.
Yeah.
Go Tigers.
Well, I spent the first 13 years of my life in Chicago, and then was dragged to Ridgefield. And by dragged, I mean, like, who wants to move when they're in 8th grade? Nobody.
No one.
But it was an amazing place to go to high school, and I probably would not have gone to Northwestern had we stayed in Chicago, because I would want to go to school close home, so it saved me. I love this question, and you didn't know this. So I'm the woman who made me a writer more than anybody else was my 11th grade English teacher, Kathy Wassel. Oh, okay. She was the first person who ever gave me a C. And she gave me back a paper that looked like Barack Obama had been through it, with lines and edits everywhere. And as kind of like an insufferable little shit, I went up and said, nobody's ever given me a C before. What is the meaning of this? And to her credit, she sat me down and walked me through every single edit and showed me what I'd been doing wrong my entire life that no one had ever corrected me about. And she made me a writer. And then the next year I had Bob Cox for AP English Lit, and he made me a reader. I'd always been a voracious reader, but he made me a critical reader and a deep reader. And 2 weeks from tonight, I'm doing an event in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and my moderators are Kathy Wassel and Bob Cox, my English teachers.
All right. This book is seriously so beautifully written. No offense to every one of our other Obama colleagues, but it's more beautifully written than any of the other books. You can buy it here, I think, right? Yes? There are copies here. You may be signing some. I may be I'm just like volunteering him to do stuff. He's going to sign books. You can buy books. But it's beautiful. Thank you all for coming. Congratulations. Cody, New York Times bestseller.
Thank you very much.